myself, they call me J-O-N to the easy E. Know that we undefeated.
Let's kick off the speakers of the afternoon. We've got Daniel Tenner, who is the founder of Pledger and Granttree, and he's going to be discussing how NFTs can revolutionize startup funding. Give it up for Daniel.
Hello. Well, quite a hard act to follow, this amazing music. But I'll do my best. What I thought I might do is today, to follow up the music, I'll talk to you about a little bit of magic. Specifically the kind of magic that happens when you mix together a couple of things that aren't normally found together. A bit about myself. My name is Daniel Tenner, aka Swombat. I've been in startups for about 15 years. I've worked with hundreds of tech startup founders, and recently I've started a new business called Pledger. So what's the magic about? Well, this magic happens when you, in a combination that brings together a couple of things that, as far as I know, haven't been brought together before. Now, everyone around here knows about NFTs, I guess, and PFPs more specifically. Back when I entered the NFT space, what surprised me was that most of these PFP projects looked a lot like startups to me, though everyone else seemed to disagree. Maybe it was because CryptoPunks, the original NFT project, the original PFP project, I should say, was more of a kind of art experiment, and everyone else was afraid of Gary Gensler, and so they were all desperately pretending not to be startups. But from my perspective, these were basically teams that were working to plans, aka roadmaps, that have visions of things they wanted to bring into the world, and they were being funded by investors who expected a return. So they might be really bad startups, all copying each other's rather bad design patterns, often with no product, often filled with anonymous scammers and hustlers, and very short-term investors who all expected a 10x return in a week, but they were still startups. So I started looking for real entrepreneurs with real businesses that were being funded by NFTs so that I could invest in them. But they never came. Why? Well, first of all, as people around here probably knows, everyone is kind of afraid of Gary Gensler's SEC, and so everyone was kind of pretending not to be startups. This created a really huge obstacle for NFT projects because they kind of tried to pretend that NFT holders were co-owners of the business, but they weren't really, because these businesses had real shares owned by real investors who were the actual real owners of the business. So that left the value drivers for NFTs being just community and utility and collectability, which made for less good investments. Another big problem was how hard it is for people to get into the NFT space, all the barriers to entry, which meant that the NFT space became this kind of sort of incestuous pool of believers who were largely all just chasing the next pump, rather than having more normal people, normal founders, normal investors who might have more reasonable expectations. Finally, another problem is you can't really deny the stench of Ponzi that has sort of permeated the NFT space over the last couple of years. And that's another reason for sensible people to stay away from NFTs as an investment. So the lack of real businesses using NFTs as a fundraising model makes sense. But I think it's a huge missed opportunity because once you fix the problems with the NFT fundraising model, it becomes really, really interesting. See, the thing is, NFTs might have problems, but shares also have their share of problems. First, there's the liquidity, or the lack thereof. Now, if you think NFTs are illiquid assets, you should try startup shares. If you make a seed investment in a startup, typically you can't sell it for the next 5 to 10 years until the startup exits. That's true whether you're a VC investor or an angel or a crowdfunding enthusiast. Imagine buying a token with a 10-year lockup period. Another problem is, even if you buy into the right startup and they do build a decent business, something might go wrong before that fabled exit event. And so you could invest in a startup, see it go and do very well over the next 5 years, and then something goes wrong, and your investment is all worth zero because of something that you couldn't predict that would happen 5 years later, because you couldn't exit before that. Even worse, even if you actually do invest in the next unicorn and they do build an amazing new business, VCs, professional investors, often come in with these things called liquidation preferences and really good deal terms that mean that early seed investors can be effectively diluted down to much less than they might expect to have unless they can afford really huge follow-on rounds. Yet one more problem is that through an overabundance of caution, regulators have cut off most investors from buying shares. By the time a startup goes public, if that ever even happens, accredited investors, aka people who are already rich, have already scooped off most of the gains that come from the early years of a business, leaving only crumbs for everyone else. Yet one more problem is how geographically local the entire fundraising scene, the equity fundraising scene is. That's why equity crowdfunding platforms have done variously well. Republic in the US has done okay because the US is a very large home market. Crowdcube and Seedrs in the UK, in a much more smaller, more fragmented market, has not done so well. Yet one more problem is that the current fundraising landscape is highly discriminatory. People of color get funded at much lower rates, as do women. Women statistically are more likely to return better returns to investors and more likely to be successful, yet they only get 2% of the equity funding. And finally, shares are really boring and unengaging. Once the seed funding round or the crowdfunding round is over, investors return to whatever they were doing before, because it's quite hard to get excited about a number that's only going to change once or twice in the next 5 years. But what if you could combine those two things together? Everyone in crypto is generally focused on fractionalizing everything to tokens. And so nobody seems to have yet realized that maybe there's some value to be made from going the other way. What if you could bundle things together and turn a boring number into something that's much more fun and exciting? What if you could create a whole that's more than the sum of its parts? A real financial stake in a business, real equity that gives you real ownership and participation rights, community benefits that engage and excite and incentivize people so that they can become super fans and evangelists, real utility connected to a real product that people actually want to use and therefore has real value, and the collectability that meets a universal human need that we all share to collect things that we like, whether physical or digital. A real financial stake, community benefits, real utility, and collectability, all in one nice, unique package. I believe once you put these things together, something magical happens, and we create a new kind of investment product that's better than what's come before. Bundling shares with NFTs creates a new type of funding that's more fun and more engaging to customers. Now, investors are great, but they tend to only care about whether the number goes up. Customers, if they can be engaged to be investors, tend to care more about the actual purpose of the business, which is not just to make a profit, but also to actually serve its customers. This also creates stickier investments because people are less likely to sell things that they're emotionally attached to. It means that when professional investors inevitably do exit their position, they might actually sell to customers who want the utility or the community access or the collectability that the NFT offers, rather than just to a greater fool who expects that the number will keep going up forever. It also fixes a major problem of the VC funding industry, which is its myopic focus on finding the next unicorn. Most businesses are not going to be the next unicorn, and so they're not well served by this VC industry as it is right now. Better liquidity up front means that it's possible to make a decent return making early investments in smaller, humbler businesses. That might grow by a factor of 2 or 3x over the next few years, rather than needing to chase that 100x unicorn. It makes a whole new class of businesses investable. Now, you might say, Daniel, that sounds very good, but the SEC will never go for it. It's dead in the water. These NFTs are securities, and they won't be allowed to exist. But the US isn't everything. The EU has a much better regulatory regime. As we saw earlier today, the UK is also working on doing things right. If you get an EU regulator on site, You also unlock the whole EU through passporting rights. And most other countries will be okay with something being sold to them that's regulated in the EU, so long as it isn't a huge scam. Well, apart from the US and China. The idea that the US has to be included for this to work is a myth. There are huge numbers of businesses being created everywhere, all around the world, every day, and most of them need funding. Also, many crypto-wealthy people have already moved outside of the US anyway, precisely because of those difficult crypto laws that are there right now. There's plenty of money outside, and as we've seen, there is an appetite for investing in hopeful new ventures. I promise you some magic. How about a novel, revolutionary way to fund small businesses? Global from day one, more inclusive towards more founders and more investors, with better liquidity, more engagement, more stickiness, and more applicability to a vast, long tail of small businesses. We're all here, I think, because we believe that crypto as a technology can change the world by reinventing the collaboration tool that is money. So how about fixing this humble but universal problem, which is how to allocate capital from those who have it to those who want to use it productively to start new businesses? Thank you very much for listening. My name is Daniel Tenner. I'll be around, but if you don't catch me, you can find me on Twitter, by Swombat, or by email, any number of other ways. Thank you. And I think we might have time for questions. Yeah, I guess. Does anybody have a question?
Hi there.
Hello.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question revolves around the regulatory aspect. So how do you make sure that, for instance, an entity that would have been created in, let's say, Germany, EU, under MiCA, could sell its securities across the world? Because nowadays, even if you're in a low liquidity sort of startup scene, you can still sell across border. So how do you deal with that in your very specific instance?
So I'm not a lawyer, so you should definitely speak to a lawyer before you do this. But from my conversations with our lawyer, what I understand is that if there is a good regulator, like, for example, Germany, regulating your investments, first of all, that gives you access to the whole EU. But also, other countries are unlikely to go and try to regulate this so long as you're not actively marketing your securities in the country. So how actively you need to be able to trigger those local regulators, it will depend. But having a website that sells the securities, most regulators will not care about that. Again, except for the US and China, which I would stay away from. Any other questions? Over there, I think.
Hi, my name is Aremba. Thank you very much for interesting presentation. I was wondering, one of the ways for token, not necessarily NFTs, potentially fungible token as well, one of the ways to make sure or to limit the chance of that being seen as a security is to make sure that the utility is high, or that there is option to participate in governance attached. Do you think that maybe that is a better way, rather than try to look for places where the law at this point is not looking at something as security, which potentially might change? So, and maybe other part is, what is your opinion about what sort of level of centralization or decentralization is the best for this type of projects, this type of fundraising? Thank you.
Yeah, so I used to also share that view that maybe the way was to try and avoid looking like a security by having utility that grows in value over time, and finding other ways around that. The reality is that with some regulators, that's still not going to fly. With the US, for example, they might declare art NFTs. I mean, they've been going after Top Shots recently. It's you're not going to get clarity by trying to keep dodging the regulators. I think a much better approach is to actually embrace the regulators, embrace the regulation, and find ways that it can be regulated legitimately. My view, which is somewhat controversial, is that actually most of the NFT projects that are pretending not to be securities, at some point when the ECC decides to start looking at them, the SEC will declare that they're all securities because largely they've been marketed as investments, and so the SEC has a very expansive definition of what that represents. I think it's better to engage with the regulator in a sort of sane jurisdiction and make the case that these are securities and that they are good securities, and there's nothing bad about being a security inherently. The question is just to make sure that you follow the regulations of wherever you're issuing the securities. So that's the approach that I suggest. Actually embrace the fact that they're securities and make them good securities.